Welcome to Crime Era Channel, where every crime tells a story. The darkest secrets of crime are uncovered, and the hidden truths of criminal underworlds come to light.
Every cult has an origin story, a convergence of ambition, charisma, and human vulnerability. For the Zizians, it began in obscurity, a small, seemingly ordinary community led by an enigmatic figure who would later command unwavering loyalty. This leader, whose vision fused apocalyptic rhetoric with promises of power and belonging, tapped into universal human desires, certainty, identity, and purpose. In the early days, recruitment was subtle, almost imperceptible, blending friendship, mentorship, and ideological appeal. The Zizians' ideology was a potent mix of moral absolutism, divine justification, and conspiratorial worldview. Followers were taught that the outside world was corrupt, dangerous, and morally bankrupt. Salvation and authority resided entirely within the group. Ordinary rules of society were reframed as irrelevant, replaced by the leader's interpretation of right and wrong. To belong was to obey was to survive. This framework was the crucible in which loyalty, fear, and devotion were forged. From the outset, the cult relied on psychological manipulation. The leader's charisma was magnetic, his confidence unwavering. Followers felt understood, valued, and chosen, even as their autonomy subtly eroded. Promises of purpose and community masked the gradual encroachment of control. Relationships outside the group were discouraged. Independent thought became morally suspect. The Zizians were not just a community. They were a carefully constructed world in which obedience was normalized, dissent marginalized, and loyalty demanded. What set the Zizians apart, however, was their mobility. Unlike many insular groups, they crossed state lines, expanding their influence and drawing new recruits into a web of ideology and control. Physical relocation strengthened psychological grip. Distance from familiar environments, family, and societal norms amplified dependence on the leader. By controlling movement, information, and interaction, the Zizians created an environment where obedience became absolute, and ordinary humans could be persuaded or coerced into extraordinary acts. Even in these early stages, signs of danger were apparent. Members demonstrated increasing willingness to subordinate morality and reason to the leader's directives. Ideology, once abstract, began to dictate daily life. The stage was set for a trajectory that would escalate from loyalty to transgression, from belief to criminal action. The origins of the Zizians reveal not only how cults take root, but how ordinary humans, driven by desire for purpose and belonging, can be drawn into worlds where obedience eclipses conscience. Fade out. Wind rustles. Shadows deepen. The story of devotion and danger begins to unfold.
The power of the Zizian leader lay in charisma, a force that drew followers into his orbit and silenced doubt. Charisma is not merely charm, it is presence, conviction, and the ability to make others believe that one holds insight into life's uncertainties. In the context of the Zizians, this magnetic authority became the engine of control, compelling obedience across state lines and enabling acts that defied morality and law. Followers perceived the leader as exceptional.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that, spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas, think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past and the pettiness. A reflection of the emptiness, hilarious. You think you're worth my time, you're delirious, mysterious, because you are behind a fake exterior.
Learned that their value within the community was tied to obedience. Subtle disapproval or perceived neglect prompted guilt and self-scrutiny, ensuring that even private thoughts aligned with the leader's vision. Emotional attachment became intertwined with authority, making dissent emotionally costly. The Zizian leader's ability to rationalize extraordinary acts was equally critical. Followers were persuaded that criminal behavior, violence, and crossing moral boundaries were not only justified but necessary. Charisma allowed the leader to redefine right and wrong, turning ordinary humans into participants in actions that would have been unimaginable outside the cult's influence. Ideology and authority merged seamlessly, making obedience a perceived moral imperative. Moreover, charisma enabled mobility. As the cult expanded across state lines, new recruits were drawn by the same magnetism, while existing members reinforced loyalty through admiration and collective identity. Distance from familiar communities amplified the psychological grip, ensuring that the leader's influence extended beyond local boundaries into a network of control and obedience. Charismatic authority is the lens through which the Zizians' actions can be understood. It is the subtle, invisible force that transforms trust into submission, guidance into coercion, and belief into participation in extraordinary acts. Without it, the ideological and structural mechanisms of control might falter. With it, obedience becomes near absolute, and the path from devotion to transgression is paved with the weight of influence.
The Zizians' ideology did more than demand loyalty. It redefined morality itself. Under the leader's influence, ordinary notions of right and wrong were reshaped, rationalized, and ultimately suspended. Actions that would have been unthinkable outside the cult became necessary, justified, and even virtuous within its confines. Crossing moral boundaries was not coerced, it was normalized, internalized, and integrated into the framework of obedience. At the core of this transformation was the leader's ability to recast ethics through ideology. Violence, theft, and intimidation were framed as divine mandate or communal necessity. Members were taught that conventional laws were irrelevant and that ultimate judgment rested solely with the leader. Moral hesitation became a threat to belonging. Ethical compliance was replaced by absolute obedience. Gradually, the line between right and wrong blurred, leaving only duty to the group and loyalty to the leader. Psychological mechanisms reinforced this shift. Peer pressure, group rituals, and constant ideological reinforcement conditioned members to accept behaviors that would otherwise trigger guilt or fear. Rationalization became automatic. Disobedience endangered salvation. Dissent threatened the community, and crossing boundaries was framed as protective or redemptive. Followers internalized these justifications, allowing obedience to override personal morality. Crossing moral boundaries also facilitated criminal acts across state lines. Theft, fraud, and even violence were carried out with the same conviction as daily routines, justified by ideology and reinforced by authority. Members reconciled transgression with purpose, surrendering conscience to the demands of the collective. Ordinary humans, guided by loyalty and belief, became participants in acts that defied social norms and legal statutes, highlighting the dangerous power of obedience entwined with moral reframing. This recalibration of ethics was gradual, almost imperceptible. Each small compromise, each act of rationalized wrongdoing reinforced obedience and eroded individual judgment. By the time the Zizians committed acts of murder and interstate crimes, moral transgression was not forced,
It was normalized, integrated, and embraced as duty. Understanding how the Zizians crossed moral boundaries illuminates the mechanics of ideological control. It is not merely charisma, fear, or coercion that enables obedience, but the subtle transformation of conscience itself. Within this framework, devotion and transgression are no longer opposites. They are intertwined, inseparable, and tragically potent. Fade out. Wind rises. Shadows linger. The tension of morality, obedience, and danger deepens.
Obedience is rarely a single act. It is a web, complex, interconnected, and nearly invisible. In the Zizian cult, fear, loyalty, and social reinforcement formed threads that bound members tightly to the leader's authority. Within this network, ordinary humans surrendered judgment, deferred morality, and followed directives that often escalated to criminal acts across state lines. The web begins with social pressure. Members observe each other complying, performing rituals, and demonstrating loyalty. Conformity is rewarded with approval, while deviation is punished, both subtly and overtly. Peer enforcement ensures that obedience is maintained without constant direct supervision. In this way, the group itself becomes a mechanism of control, embedding ideology into behavior and thought. Fear is another thread in the web. Followers are made to perceive external threats, law enforcement, hostile society, or divine punishment as existential dangers. Simultaneously, internal fear is cultivated through guilt, shame, and the threat of disfavor from the leader. Fear conditions compliance, transforming it from reluctant participation into instinctive adherence. Ordinary decision-making is overridden by the perceived necessity of obedience. Loyalty is the glue that binds the web. As members internalize the leader's values and worldview, obedience becomes identity. Acts that would normally conflict with conscience are rationalized as duty. The leader's vision becomes a lens through which reality is interpreted, and allegiance is measured by the willingness to act, even when those acts cross moral or legal boundaries. Rituals, ideology, and authority reinforce the web continuously. Daily routines, symbolic acts, and communal reinforcement normalize obedience, integrating it into the rhythm of life. Each thread, social, psychological, and ideological, interlocks, creating a network from which deviation is increasingly difficult. Isolation, both physical and emotional, strengthens the weave, ensuring the leader's control extends across locations and situations. The web of obedience is both subtle and relentless. Members become ensnared gradually, often unaware of the full extent of their submission. By the time the Zizians committed acts of interstate crime and murder, the network of influence was complete. Loyalty, fear, and conformity had fused into a psychological structure that dictated behavior, moral reasoning, and ultimately, life and death decisions. Fade out. Wind whispers. Hum lingers. The invisible threads of obedience remain palpable, tense, and foreboding. The Zizians did not remain confined to one location or a single group of followers. Expansion was integral to their ideology and survival. Recruitment was methodical, psychological, and strategic. The leader recognized that growth required more than charisma. It demanded a system to attract, indoctrinate, and retain members, often across state lines, creating both opportunity and peril. Recruitment relied on human vulnerability. Prospective members were often seeking meaning, community, or escape from personal crises. The Zizian leader provided certainty, purpose, and belonging. Subtle manipulation was employed to exploit these desires.
Invitations to gatherings, small acts of kindness, or promises of enlightenment created emotional bonds before ideological control was imposed. The impression of a supportive, exclusive community masked the gradual erosion of autonomy. Expansion across states was facilitated by mobility and relocation. Members were encouraged or required to leave familiar environments, sever ties with family, and integrate fully into the cult's orbit. Physical relocation reinforced psychological control. Removed from the influence of outside perspectives, followers became increasingly dependent on the leader and the community for guidance, validation, and moral framing. Distance became both a protective barrier and a mechanism for deeper indoctrination. Recruitment tactics also leveraged social proof. Existing members were enlisted to identify and persuade potential recruits. Personal testimonies, displays of devotion, and communal rituals created a compelling image of belonging and purpose. Observers saw a committed, cohesive community and were drawn to its apparent stability and certainty. The leader's charisma amplified these efforts, transforming ordinary persuasion into psychological leverage. Expansion increased both influence and danger. With each new recruit, the cult's ideology spread, and the potential for criminal activity, including interstate crimes, grew. Members were not only loyal, they were operational extensions of the leader's will. The combination of psychological conditioning, mobility, and strategic recruitment allowed the Zizians to cross physical and moral boundaries with alarming efficiency. Understanding recruitment and expansion reveals the mechanics of control. Loyalty was cultivated before coercion. Obedience was normalized before moral compromise. The spread of influence created a network of individuals prepared to act collectively, reinforcing ideology and enabling transgression. Recruitment was not merely growth, it was the foundation for the cult's eventual escalation into criminal acts and violence. Fade out. Wind shifts softly. Shadows deepen. The sense of reach and influence extends beyond the immediate scene.
Isolation is the crucible in which the Zizians' obedience was forged. Physical separation, emotional control, and social confinement created an environment where the leader's ideology became the sole lens through which reality was interpreted. Indoctrination was not instantaneous. It was methodical, immersive, and unrelenting, binding followers to authority and suppressing independent thought. Physical isolation served multiple purposes. Members were relocated across state lines, often to remote compounds or rented spaces removed from familiar social networks. This distance reduced exposure to dissenting opinions, minimized interference from family or authorities, and created a controlled environment in which the leader's narrative dominated perception. The outside world was portrayed as dangerous, corrupt, and morally bankrupt, making departure both psychologically and practically difficult. Emotional isolation reinforced dependence. The leader cultivated intimacy selectively. Attention and praise were rewards, while criticism or disapproval elicited guilt, shame, and fear. Followers learned to regulate behavior not only through direct instruction, but through anticipation of approval. Emotional bonds to the leader, combined with disconnection from external support systems, created intense psychological attachment. Doubt or hesitation became internal conflicts rather than challenges to authority. Social isolation played a critical role. Peer monitoring, communal rituals, and group enforcement ensured that compliance was both observed and normalized. Members internalized the behaviors, beliefs, and moral frameworks of the community, policing themselves and one another. Deviance was discouraged, conformity rewarded, and the sense of belonging became inseparable from obedience. Indoctrination was cumulative. Daily rituals, repetitive ideological reinforcement, and communal reinforcement conditioned followers to equate loyalty with virtue. Ordinary decision-making, moral judgment, and independent thought were gradually overridden. The cult's ideology became internalized, guiding behavior, shaping perception, and rationalizing actions, including those that crossed legal or ethical boundaries. By the time the Zizians committed acts of interstate crime and violence, isolation and indoctrination had rendered resistance nearly impossible. Followers were not coerced in every action.
They were conditioned to act as extensions of authority, perceiving the leader's directives as both necessary and morally justified. Isolation and indoctrination were not just tools of control, they were the foundation of obedience, the engine that drove ordinary humans to extraordinary and criminal behavior. Fade out. Wind rises softly. Shadows linger. A palpable sense of containment and tension remains.
The transition from obedience to action often begins in secrecy. For the Zizians, planning criminal acts was not a sudden impulse, but a calculated process, orchestrated by the leader and rationalized through ideology. Ordinary individuals, bound by loyalty and conditioned by fear, became willing participants in plots that crossed state lines and violated moral, legal, and social norms. Planning was methodical. Meetings were conducted in isolation, away from prying eyes. Instructions were precise, yet couched in moral and ideological language that reframed illegality as duty. Tasks were divided among members, creating a sense of shared responsibility while diffusing personal accountability. Each participant understood that obedience was expected, not optional, and that deviation could endanger both the individual and the group. Psychological manipulation reinforced compliance. The leader justified actions as necessary for survival, divine mandate, or the preservation of the community. Rationalization became automatic. Theft, intimidation, and even murder were presented as logical extensions of ideology. Members internalized these justifications, reducing hesitation and transforming moral conflict into perceived necessity. Ordinary humans, when guided by loyalty and ideology, became operational instruments of authority. Social dynamics intensified the process. Peer pressure, communal oversight, and public affirmation ensured that participation was normalized and dissent suppressed. Members observed each other following instructions, reinforcing obedience through collective conformity. Deviance was met with subtle punishment, isolation, or emotional censure, solidifying the web of control that made participation psychologically compelling. Planning also exploited mobility and secrecy. Crossing state lines added layers of logistical and psychological control. Relocation removed members from familiar oversight, making escape or refusal more difficult. Geographic distance reinforced dependence on the leader and amplified the perception that the outside world was hostile, legitimizing extreme measures. By the time the Zizians executed their plans, obedience was absolute. Fear, loyalty, indoctrination, and rationalization converged, transforming ordinary humans into agents of crime. The planning phase reveals the mechanics of control. Careful orchestration, ideological framing, and psychological reinforcement combined to make participation appear not only justified, but inevitable. Understanding this stage is crucial. It is the moment when abstract ideology transforms into tangible action, when loyalty intersects with moral compromise, and when obedience becomes a force capable of crossing ethical, legal, and state boundaries. Fade out. Whispered wind. Shadows lengthen. The tension of impending violence hangs palpably in the air.
The Zizians' planning reached its horrifying culmination in acts of violence. What began as obedience and loyalty escalated into actions that crossed moral and legal boundaries, leaving a trail of fear, injury, and death. The group's ideology, reinforced through isolation, indoctrination, and charismatic authority, transformed ordinary humans into participants in extraordinary acts of harm. Violence was framed as both necessity and duty. Followers were taught that opposition, whether from outsiders, perceived enemies, or even reluctant community members, threatened survival and salvation. The leader's directives rationalized aggression, reinterpreting moral restraint as weakness and obedience as virtue. Ordinary ethical instincts were suppressed, replaced by loyalty-driven action.
The methods were deliberate. Crimes were executed with coordination, secrecy, and precision. Each member understood their role, the expected compliance, and the ideological justification. Fear of punishment, combined with peer reinforcement, ensured participation. Acts of intimidation, assault, and murder were no longer considered optional. They were moral imperatives within the framework established by the leader. Psychologically, the impact on followers was profound. They were acting not out of personal malice, but under the sway of authority, ideology, and social conditioning. Rationalization, peer observation, and constant reinforcement made transgressions seem natural, necessary, even righteous. The ability to disassociate from conventional morality highlights the dangerous potency of obedience when guided by an unchallenged authority. The interstate dimension magnified the stakes. Crossing state lines to commit criminal acts introduced logistical complexity, legal risk, and psychological pressure. Yet, the Zizians' cohesion, reinforced by ideology and peer dynamics, enabled them to act decisively and collectively. Geographic distance amplified the insularity of thought and obedience, making intervention or reconsideration nearly impossible. The acts of violence were both a consequence of the leader's influence and a testament to the mechanisms of control. Fear, indoctrination, social enforcement, and charisma converged, erasing moral hesitation and enabling participation in acts that ordinary humans would otherwise reject. The results were immediate, tangible, and irreversible, leaving communities, families, and victims to grapple with the aftermath. Understanding these acts is crucial to comprehending the full scope of obedience, manipulation, and ideology. They are not anomalies, but predictable outcomes when psychological control intersects with opportunity, isolation, and unchallenged authority. Fade out. Wind rises. Silence stretches. The shadow of violence lingers, heavy and haunting.
Even the most tightly controlled cult cannot remain impervious to external scrutiny indefinitely. For the Zizians, the intersection of criminal activity, interstate movement, and heightened visibility eventually drew the attention of law enforcement. Investigation and intervention exposed the fragility underlying the appearance of unity, revealing the human and ideological vulnerabilities that sustained the group. Law enforcement faced unique challenges. The Zizians' mobility across state lines complicated jurisdiction, while secrecy, fear, and psychological control within the group limited information flow. Investigators relied on patterns of behavior, tips from relatives or former members, and surveillance to piece together the scope of the cult's activities. The isolation and indoctrination that had enabled obedience also delayed detection, allowing the leader to maintain authority and influence for longer than might otherwise have been possible. Within the group, tension mounted. Members who had long suppressed doubt or moral hesitation began to feel the pressure of external forces. Obedience remained high, but cracks in compliance emerged as the consequences of past actions loomed. The leader attempted to reinforce control, using fear, loyalty, and ideological rationalization to maintain cohesion. Yet the interplay between external enforcement and internal strain accelerated the group's trajectory toward collapse. The collapse was both organizational and psychological. Arrests, raids, and legal exposure disrupted the chain of command, while followers confronted the tangible consequences of obedience. Some remained loyal, justifying actions through ideology, while others resisted or attempted escape. The disintegration revealed the dependence on authority, highlighting how obedience had supplanted personal judgment and moral reasoning. Collapse also illustrates a broader truth. Cults, no matter how insular or ideologically reinforced, are vulnerable to accountability. The mechanisms of control, charisma, isolation, peer pressure, and indoctrination are powerful but not absolute. External scrutiny, combined with legal and social consequences, can disrupt the web of obedience, forcing confrontation with reality and revealing the human cost of ideological submission. For the Zizians, the aftermath left a fractured group, criminal charges, and communities struggling to comprehend the magnitude of betrayal and harm.
The law's intervention marked the end of the leader's control, but the psychological, emotional, and social repercussions persisted. It was a collapse that underscored both the power and the peril of obedience. Fade out. Distant sirens fade. Wind rises softly. Silence and reflection linger over the remnants of control and devotion.
The story of the Zizians is a cautionary tale, a study in obedience, ideology, and the fragility of moral judgment. Across state lines, the cult's influence transformed ordinary humans into participants in acts of violence, illustrating how charisma, isolation, and psychological control can converge with devastating effect. The lessons extend beyond the specifics of this group, offering insight into human vulnerability and the mechanisms that enable obedience to cross moral and legal boundaries. The first lesson lies in the power of authority. Charismatic leaders can shape perception, redefine morality, and manipulate loyalty, often gradually and subtly. Ordinary individuals, when confronted with certainty, purpose, and social reinforcement, can surrender personal judgment in ways that make extraordinary actions, ethical transgressions, criminal activity seem necessary or justified. Recognizing the magnetic influence of authority is crucial to preventing blind obedience. Second, isolation and indoctrination amplify vulnerability. Physical removal from familiar networks, emotional dependence on the group, and repetitive ideological reinforcement consolidate control. Separation from alternative perspectives diminishes critical thinking, making obedience the default response. Understanding the mechanisms of isolation highlights why intervention, awareness, and social support are essential safeguards. Third, obedience is cumulative and socially reinforced. Daily rituals, pure observation, and communal validation normalize compliance, turning ideology into habit and habit into instinct. The Zizians' crimes were not sudden impulses. They were the predictable outcome of a network of influence, trust, and authority that had been meticulously cultivated over time. Finally, vigilance and education are the strongest defenses. Society, families, and communities must recognize warning signs, cultivate critical thinking, and provide avenues for questioning and autonomy. Lessons from the Zizians demonstrate that prevention is possible, but only when the subtle interplay of loyalty, fear, and influence is understood and addressed. The Zizians remind us that ideology alone does not drive human behavior. Obedience, dependence, and social reinforcement are equally potent. The convergence of these forces can transform ordinary humans into agents of harm, illustrating the importance of awareness, accountability, and reflection. The story closes not merely with the leader's collapse, arrests, and legal consequences, but with the enduring lesson. When authority goes unchallenged and obedience becomes absolute, the potential for destruction is immense. Recognizing, understanding, and countering these dynamics is the only safeguard against history repeating itself. Fade out. Wind rises softly. Silence stretches. The shadow of obedience and ideology lingers, haunting and instructive. Thank you for stopping by at Crime Era Channel. We hope you enjoyed your time here. Ensure you like and subscribe to our channel so you get notified each time we uncover another hidden crime story. Don't forget to share so your friends and family so they too can know the hidden truth.